Have you ever been offered food by a stranger? Most of us would politely decline, but this African folktale teaches us why that might not be the best idea. Join me as we explore the wisdom behind this ancient story and its surprising relevance in today's world. In the golden dawn that bathed the edge of the savannah, a lone traveler emerged, dusty-footed and sunburnt, his cloak stiff with days of journeying under the harsh African sun. His name was Akwu, a man known in distant lands for his sharp tongue and cleverness, but his pride had grown taller than the baobab trees he passed. His stomach rumbled like thunder, yet his spirit would not bend to beg. As he approached a small village hidden between rolling hills and whispering fields of maize, children danced in the dust and elders sat in shade, weaving baskets and stories alike. The smell of roasted yam and palm oil stew filled the air, and, though his legs faltered, Akwu's pride held him upright. When an old woman waved him down and offered a steaming bowl of food without asking his name or origin, he eyed her with suspicion. Her back was bent, but her face glowed with the quiet wisdom of many harvests. Still, Akwu declined, saying he would rather find his own way. The villagers paused, their eyes heavy with knowing. The woman simply nodded, setting the bowl on a wooden stool beside her, untouched. As Akwu walked past, the village breeze shifted, and the birds stopped singing for a moment. Something unseen had changed, something ancient had been awakened by the refusal. But Akwu, blind in pride, continued on, never suspecting that his journey had just taken a turn. The earth itself would remember. The path beyond the village was no longer the one he thought he knew. The land twisted gently, subtly changing beneath. His feet, like an old spirit, shifting in its grave. He walked for hours, but the trees looked the same, and the sun no longer moved across the sky. Thirst began to gnaw at his throat, and hunger clung to his belly like a leech. Yet the deeper he went, the more the forest seemed to close around him, thick with vines and silence. A strange fog rolled in, scentless but dense, curling through the trees like ghostly breath. The traveler tried to retrace his steps, but the ground swallowed his footprints. Birds no longer called, and even insects seemed to hold their breath. He saw shapes in the mist, faces carved from air, watching. Still, he told himself this was a mere illusion, a trick of fatigue. He clung to his logic like a crutch, though. His body screamed for nourishment and warmth. In his pocket, the dried koli nut he had saved was now rotten. The bread he packed had turned to ash. He cursed it under his breath, but the forest did not care. The traveler, once so proud, now walked in circles, weakened, yet still unwilling to return to that humble village where food had been offered without question. Somewhere deep within, the land had decided to teach him something that words never could, something only the hungry spirit would understand too late. By nightfall, the traveler stumbled upon a silent clearing where a small fire crackled mysteriously at the center, with no one to tend it. A large flat stone beside the flames bore fresh food: cassava bread, goat meat, and roasted plantain, still warm. The scent curled into his starving nose like music into silence. His knees buckled, but again his pride tightened its grip. He looked around, expecting someone to emerge, someone to explain, to serve, to honor him. When no one came, he spat on the ground beside the stone and said to himself that a man of his stature could not eat from a plate left alone, like a stray dog. He turned his back to the food, even as his stomach clenched in betrayal. The fire dimmed, flickering in slow protest, and the wind shifted cold and sharp. Shadows moved across the edges of the clearing, slow and watching. The earth under him no longer felt solid, and the trees leaned inward, curious and judgmental. The clearing grew darker, and a howl echoed from somewhere not too far, neither animal nor human, but somewhere in between. Still he walked away, not even glancing back. The food turned to stone behind him, and the fire snuffed itself out as though embarrassed by his arrogance. Unseen by him, a pair of ancient eyes blinked open in the darkness, not angry, only disappointed. In that moment, the traveler's lesson had begun, though he still believed he was the one in control. That night, Aku collapsed beneath a tree whose roots curled like fingers around secrets long buried. As he lay on the bare ground, the forest pulsed with whispers soft at first, then rising like drumming rain. Dreams overtook him, visions of great banquets he could not touch, rivers that turned to sand as he bent to drink, and familiar faces, turning away when he reached for help. In one dream, he was a child again, alone and weeping beside an empty calabash, while an old woman with clouded eyes sat silently across from him, holding a bowl he could not reach. He awoke shivering, his mouth dry, his limbs weak. Around him, the forest was still but not peaceful. The silence was heavy, alive, filled with judgment. He saw a trail of white stones, faintly glowing, leading away from the tree. Desperate and too tired to question anymore, he followed. With each step, the weight of his pride began to splinter. His thoughts no longer revolved around appearance, honor, or image. Instead, they returned to that village, to the bowl on the stool, and to the old woman's quiet eyes. He now understood something ancient, that food was not just sustenance, but a language of spirit. It was an invitation not just to eat, but to connect. And in rejecting that bowl, he had rejected the very fabric of kinship. As dawn returned in streaks of red and gold, Aku's heart began to change. But the journey was far from over. The glowing stones led him to a place he did not expect, a river, still and black as obsidian, unmoving as if time had frozen beneath its surface. There was no bridge, yet on the other side stood a woman stirring a pot, the scent of simmering okra soup floating across the water like a promise. She never looked up, but her presence pierced him. Aku called out, but his voice made no sound. He waved his arms, but she continued stirring. In frustration, he stepped toward the river, but his foot met not water, but resistance like glass. He was trapped on his side. As he stared in disbelief, the woman dipped a calabash into the pot and placed it gently on the earth beside her, just as the old woman in the village had. A crow flew down and caught at him, circling thrice before disappearing into the trees. That's when he realized this was not a river of water, but a river of memory, of chances lost and wisdom ignored. And to cross it, one must leave something behind. But he carried nothing now but his pride, and pride had no weight here, it was invisible to the ancestors. He fell to his knees, unable to cry, for even tears had turned to vapor within him. The woman finally raised her eyes, and he saw in them every elder he had ever ignored, every lesson he had dismissed. The river remained still, for it was not ready to let him cross. Wandering back into the forest, Aku came upon a circle of ancient trees, each so wide 3 men could not wrap their arms around one. In the center was a wooden stool carved with sacred markings, and atop it sat a calabash sealed with red cloth. This time there was no smell, no heat, only silence. He hesitated, then approached slowly, heart pounding. He picked up the calabash and felt a pulse like a heartbeat, not his own. His hands trembled. In that moment, a whisper passed through the leaves, the voice of 1,000 elders humming as one. It is not the food, but the gesture. He dropped to his knees, clutching the calabash, and wept. For all the pride, all the judgment, all the rejections of kindness he had made in life. He remembered when a child offered him roasted groundnuts and he tossed them aside. When a blind man extended half a banana and he walked past. In his quest for greatness, he had mistaken generosity for weakness. The calabash in his hand warmed, the cloth unraveling on its own, revealing thick, honeyed millet porridge. He drank, and with every sip, he felt memories return of his mother feeding him in the dark, of strangers who had once been kind. The porridge tasted like regret and forgiveness at once. The forest sighed. Something had been restored, but a price still waited. For lessons are not complete when we realize the truth. They are complete when we share it. as he stood up from the stool, a path opened where no path had been. The trees parted, not by wind but by spirit, and at the end stood a small round hut, with smoke curling from its thatch. He approached slowly, now without fear or pride. A young girl sat outside, no more than 9, barefoot, her clothes patched with care. In her lap was a gourd of palm wine and a small bowl of beans and yam. She looked at him and gestured toward the food without a word. Aku paused, then dropped to one knee, not out of hunger, but humility. He took the bowl with both hands, bowed his head, and ate slowly, reverently. The girl smiled softly, her eyes too old for her age, and vanished like dust in wind. The hut dissolved. In its place was the road back to the village. He walked now with lighter steps, not because he was fed, but because he was empty of ego, of judgment, of everything that once kept him blind. The village reappeared on the horizon, and the sun cast long forgiving rays across his path. The same children played in the dust, and the old woman still sat with the same bowl. But this time, Aku approached first. He knelt, took the bowl gently, and whispered a thank you with his soul, not his mouth. The woman smiled but said nothing. She didn't need to. She had always known he would return. That evening, the village gathered. Aku stood beneath the great Iroko tree and spoke, not as a traveler, but as a man reborn. He told them of the river of memory, the calabash of regret, and the little girl who was not a girl at all, but a spirit, sent to test his transformation. He confessed every moment of pride, every kindness refused, and every lesson missed. The elders nodded, not in surprise, but in approval, for they too had once made such journeys. The children listened wide-eyed, learning without knowing. And the old woman who had first offered him food remained quiet, her eyes sparkling with ancient understanding. That night, they feasted not in honor of a guest, but in honor of humility. Aku was no longer a traveler, nor a man seeking greatness. He became a teacher, a storyteller, a keeper of the lesson. He reminded the people that in African tradition, food is sacred, not only as nourishment, but as a bridge between souls. To refuse it is to close the door to destiny, to silence the wisdom of the elders. And so the story of Aku became a song sung during harvest, a tale whispered by firelight, a proverb carved into drums. Never refuse food from a stranger, the elders would say, for the spirit walks among us wearing many faces. And those who listen, who truly listened, never walked hungry, not in body, and never again in spirit, not in the old traditions of the land, long before roads carved through forests and concrete buried the soil. Hospitality was not just a custom, it was a sacred duty. A stranger arriving in a village was considered a message from the ancestors, a mirror through which the community's spirit was tested. Food, water, and a place to rest were offered before names were exchanged. Even the poorest family would break their last piece of yam to share with a guest. To offer food was not merely about feeding a mouth, it was a declaration, you are one of us. Elders told stories of rain falling only after a hungry traveler had been fed, of barren women conceiving after giving a thirsty stranger water. These tales weren't just metaphor, they were woven into the very soil. The cooking fire wasn't lit only for the household, it was a beacon for the lost, the tired, the unknown soul who might knock at dusk. And in this sacred offering, respect bloomed. The young learned to see food as more than substance, it was the spirit of the home laid bare. And when one accepted food, they accepted the love and trust wrapped inside it. So when someone like Aku refused, the harm wasn't in the empty bowl, it was in the broken thread that once connected stranger to host, heart to heart. This was why every elder kept their door half open and a pot gently simmering. Not for the body, but for the spirit seeking refuge. Among the elders, respect was not measured in words, but in gestures, silence, and how one received what was given freely. A bowl of porridge handed with wrinkled fingers carried stories of droughts survived, wars endured, children buried, and grandchildren born. To take that bowl with both hands and a bowed head was to honor all of that history. This was why elders often tested the youth not with questions, but with acts of quiet generosity. They watched not how one spoke, but how one received. Was the back bent? Were the eyes grateful? Did the hands tremble with understanding or entitlement? In one village, an elder once offered a roasted lizard tail to a visiting merchant. The merchant scoffed and walked away. Days later, he fell ill, and only the elder's herbs healed him. That story became legend, not for fear, but as a lesson: never mock what is given with sincerity. Aku had once missed this truth, but in sharing his story, he reopened the eyes of many who had grown too modern, too proud. He reminded them that the sacredness of food came not from what was in the bowl, but from who offered it, and that every refusal was a choice to embrace the shared spirit of community, or to shut the door on something ancient and vital. Respect, like food, must be accepted fully. Otherwise both spoil. And in Africa, where ancestors walk beside the living, such spoiling echoes beyond the earth and into the spirit realm. The village of Aku's rebirth became a place of pilgrimage. People came from other regions, not for miracles, but to hear the story told at dusk beneath the great tree. And in hearing it, they remembered. A woman who had ignored her mother's last meal sat weeping with a bowl of rice before her. A boy who mocked a beggar now carried food daily to strangers near the river. One elder said, "The story found us because we were forgetting," and it was true. Modern life had crept in, fences built higher, doors locked tighter, meals eaten behind curtains instead of shared in open courtyards. But Aku's tale cracked something open. It reminded everyone that a hungry person at your door was not a burden, but a test of your spirit. The village women resumed their tradition of leaving small plates by the gate each evening, just in case a traveler passed. Children were taught to greet guests with water before asking their names. And slowly, peace returned, not because troubles vanished, but because people remembered how to see each other again. Food became sacred once more. Even the birds sang differently, as if in approval. Elders smiled more often, knowing the chain had not been broken. And Aku, once lost in the forest of pride, now walked every day with humility, visiting homes not to eat, but to remind each person, in every shared meal, there's a doorway to something greater than ourselves. In time, Aku was invited to tell his story in faraway places, cities with glass towers and flashing lights where people rushed past each other, heads down, hands busy, hearts elsewhere. He sat on radio shows, under bright lights, speaking softly but with great weight. Some laughed at him, calling his tale an old myth. Others listened and wept, realizing how long it had been since they had sat with a stranger, since they had fed someone without expecting anything in return. A woman from the city called weeks later to say she had fed a man at the train station and learned he was a retired teacher who once saved her uncle's life. A student wrote him a letter saying she now volunteered at a shelter because his story reminded her of her grandmother. Aku did not seek fame or riches. He only told the story. But the story walked on its own feet, whispering in taxis, offices, homes. In the end, Aku returned to his village, older now, but at peace. He sat once more beneath the great Iroko tree, where children came not for food, but for wisdom. And every now and then, a traveler arrived tired, hungry, lost. And every time, without fail, Aku would rise, go inside, and bring out a bowl. He would smile and say nothing, because the bowl spoke louder than any word. And the traveler who accepted it would unknowingly pass the final test, the test of the heart, far beyond the red soil of Aku's village, in a modern African city where cars buzzed like angry bees and skyscrapers stabbed the clouds. People had grown distant. In this place, Kindness was considered weakness, and no one trusted strangers. But something began to shift. A young woman named Amma, raised in the city, heard Aku's story one evening on the radio while stuck in traffic. At first, she shrugged it off, too superstitious, too old-fashioned, but the story clung to her. Days later, she passed a frail man outside her office building. He held a sign asking not for money, but simply food. She hesitated, the lessons of her fast-paced world tugging at her. But something stirred deep inside, an echo of her grandmother's voice reminding her of the old ways. She walked to a nearby stall, bought a warm plate of jollof rice and fish, and gave it to him. The man looked at her with tearful eyes, nodded, and whispered blessings in a language she didn't understand. That night, she dreamt of a forest path, a glowing river, and an old woman smiling from across a fire. The next morning, her inbox held a job offer she never applied for, from a company whose CEO turned out to be the man's son. Whether coincidence or fate, Amma never forgot that moment. She became a quiet advocate of kindness, telling her story whenever she could. And like Aku, she understood now, food shared with a stranger is never just food. It's destiny knocking. Softly. In another corner of the continent, a teenage boy named Jide scrolled mindlessly through his phone when he stumbled upon a short video. It featured an old man seated under a tree, telling the story with slow, deliberate words. It was Aku. And though the video had poor sound, Jide was captivated. He had grown up in a city apartment, meals ordered through apps, guests rare and always announced. Yet this tale of offering food to strangers sparked something within. Later that week, his school launched a community outreach program. Jide, usually disinterested, volunteered to distribute food in a rural area. At first, he was awkward, out of place among children with bare feet and weathered smiles. But when he offered a young girl his packed lunch, the look in her eyes changed. She broke the bread in two, offering him half. That moment shattered his understanding of generosity. She had less than him, yet she shared without hesitation. Jide returned home transformed. He deleted the video games that consumed his time and began helping his mother cook, serve, and eventually organize monthly food drives. His schoolmates followed his lead. And so, a story told under a tree traveled through wires and screens, finding fertile soil even in places where tradition was forgotten. Jide never met Aku, but he often said the old man was the reason he understood what it meant to be truly human. In a world losing touch with its roots, stories like this kept the soul alive. On the dusty edge of another town, an elderly man named Baba O'Neill sat each morning with a basket of groundnuts, handing them out to anyone who passed by without cost, without questions. Most ignored him, some thought him mad. But the truth was, Baba had once been a chief, wealthy and powerful, until illness took his voice and age took his strength. He remembered a time when feeding strangers was a sign of strength, not foolishness. One day, a teenage thief snatched his basket and ran. Instead of chasing him or calling out, Baba smiled. Days later, the boy returned, broken and ashamed, but with a new basket full of fresh groundnuts. "You gave me when I had nothing," the boy wrote in charcoal on a leaf. "Now I give back." Baba nodded, tears washing his weathered cheeks. That boy went on to become the town's youngest counselor, teaching troubled youth the value of second chances. When asked what changed him, he always replied, "A madman who fed me." But Baba O'Neill was no madman, he was a living folktale. His quiet generosity reshaped lives. And those who took from his hand unknowingly took a seed, planted in their spirit. The act of accepting food without pride, without shame, and with gratitude became his ministry. The town later built a small shrine where his stool stood. And every year, people gathered to share groundnuts and stories, proof that the soul of Africa lived in her simplest offerings, in a world increasingly shaped by speed, technology, and Isolation, the ancient story of Aku, became a ripple that turned into a wave. Across countries and cultures, people began to reflect on the simple question, when was the last time I fed a stranger? In marketplaces, food sellers began setting aside one plate each day for the unknown. Churches and mosques revived the old rituals of communal meals for passers-by. Some schools added storytelling circles to their curriculum, where tales like Aku's were shared, not just for entertainment, but for awakening. And through all this, elders smiled. For they had always known that such stories were not meant to be kept in books or whispered in corners. They were meant to live, breathe, and grow. Aku never sought fame, yet his story moved through hands, mouths, and hearts like sacred wind. It reminded people that in a world obsessed with ownership, it is in giving that we remember our humanity. And food, perhaps the simplest form of giving, was the most powerful. It could break walls, melt suspicion, open the hardest soul. And those who remembered this, whether in a Lagos high-rise, a Nairobi slum, or a tiny village lost to time, became custodians of a truth that refused to die. Because the ancestors were still watching. And every time food was shared with love and humility, they clapped softly in the winds, blessing the one who dared to keep the spirit alive. In the twilight hours of his life, Aku sat beneath the same tree where his journey had once changed. His beard had turned gray like morning ash, his hands slower, but his spirit brighter than ever. Every week, new faces gathered, young and old, rich and poor, some out of curiosity, others out of reverence. He no longer told the story with grand gestures. Instead, he let silence build, and then he whispered the truth that echoed through generations. To accept food is to accept love. To share food is to become human again. His listeners always left with more than they came, for sometimes with tears, other times with quiet resolve. One day, a girl from a distant land, holding a smartphone and a journal, came to ask if she could record him. Aku agreed, but asked for one thing in return, that she take the message beyond screens and likes. Tell them, he said, that the world does not fall apart from hunger, it falls apart when we stop feeding one another. She nodded, and true to her word, her video reached millions. But more importantly, it reached kitchens. Potlucks were revived. Strangers were invited. Children were taught to set one extra plate at dinner. That was how Aku knew his work was done. Not by fame, but by firewood rekindled in hearts across continents. And as he closed his eyes beneath the great Iroko, the last thing he heard was a breeze whispering a thank you from the ancestors, from the earth, from every spirit ever fed. At the next village festival, they didn't crown a king or celebrate harvest. Instead, they held a feast of the stranger. Each family prepared a meal meant not for themselves, but for someone unknown. Pots bubbled with agusi and pepper soup, fried plantains sizzled, and baskets overflowed with fruits. Elders sat at the entrance of the village, waiting not to guard, but to welcome. Drummers played softly, and dancers moved not in performance, but in prayer. People from nearby towns came, drawn by whispers of something sacred. They were seated, fed, and honored, no names asked, no origins probed. In this celebration, no one was poor, no one was alone. Children ran from hut to hut, delivering meals wrapped in banana leaves and love. And at the heart of it all stood a carved wooden statue of Aku holding a calabash. Not a monument of grandeur, but of humility. His story was now a living festival, proof that even one man's mistake, when owned and transformed, could become a tradition of beauty. That night, fires glowed in every compound, and laughter rang deep. The people sang not of heroes, but of the power of small acts done with great spirit. And as the moon rose full and wide, someone whispered, "This is what the world forgets, that salvation is often hidden in a spoonful of food." The elders nodded. The ancestors stirred. And the story walked again, barefoot and smiling, across the continent, Communities began adding a simple ritual to every meal, a moment of silence for the stranger. Whether in mansions or mud huts, before eating, hands would pause above plates. And a thought would pass, may someone somewhere be fed. Some would even leave a small portion aside, placing it outside for a passerby, a stray animal, or the wind itself. Teachers began to ask children not just what they wanted to be, but who they had fed. Churches gave sermons not only on salvation, but on service. Mosques reminded worshippers that feeding a hungry person was equal to prayer. One school painted a mural of Aku, surrounded by bowls floating like stars. Underneath it, a quote, "The hand that accepts food humbly is never empty for long." And when questioned about its meaning, students answered with stories not from books, but from life. A businessman who began offering tea to the homeless found new peace. A widow who cooked for neighborhood orphans healed her grief. The spirit of the story had transcended its origin. It was now a heartbeat shared across tongues and tribes. It had become a lesson not about food, but about humility, reverence, and connection. In a divided world, the act of sharing a meal had stitched small wounds, one bowl at a time. And those who listened closely to the silence before eating swore they could hear a voice in the wind saying, "You remembered. So we remember you." Years after Aku's passing, a child born in a distant land sat at her grandmother's feet, listening. The air smelled of spices, wood smoke, and rain. The elder, eyes clouded with age but bright with memory, told the child the story of the traveler who refused food and learned why he must never do so again. She told it not as fiction, but as truth handed down like heirloom jewelry. The child, wide-eyed, asked why it mattered so much. The grandmother smiled and handed her a bowl of warm stew. "Because in giving this," she said, "I give you everything that came before me." The child took it with both hands, holding it close like treasure. That is how stories lived, in bowls passed down, in acts repeated, in lessons embodied. Not in textbooks or television, but in the sacred space between giver and receiver. So as you finish this story, dear listener, ask yourself not what you learned, but what you will now do. Will you offer your bowl? Will you accept another's? Will you see food as the bridge it truly is? The elders still watch. The ancestors still whisper. And the spirit of Aku still walks among us, bowl in hand, eyes searching not for praise, but for hearts willing to receive. So the next time a stranger offers you food, remember this. It is not just a meal. It is an invitation to belong, to heal, to remember. And in accepting it, you do not feed your body alone, you feed the world.